So, Glenn Behrman, founder and president of CEA Advisors, thank you so much for joining me on the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Where are you calling in from?
I live outside of Dallas.
Okay. You born and raised there?
No, I'm from New York,
Okay. What part of New York?
in New York City. There's
Uh,
only one part of New York, New York.
I grew up in Yonkers, and
Oh, okay.
yeah, I've lived in East Village, Brooklyn, Upper East Side. So I consider myself definitely a New Yorker.
I still have a community garden that I started in New York 30 years ago in the East Village on 11th Street.
Wow. When's the last time
Yeah,
you've
it's
been?
one of the few community gardens that remain in New York.
When's the last time you've been down there?
Oh, please. I'm a tourist. I mean, the closest I've gotten to New York is Kennedy Airport.
Yeah. What do you miss most about it?
Everything. I miss the food, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you miss certain things. I'm probably gonna go in July to visit my folks in Yonkers and then try to make a stop in the city, but last time I was there was for indoor ag tech when they had it in Times Square, and that was
Yeah,
pretty.
I remember that. I think I was there for that. I stayed in a hotel right nearby and I couldn't believe it. I mean, I was flabbergasted at what Times Square had become,
Yeah, yeah,
not
for
in a
sure.
good way.
No, very Disneyfied, and it's just I remember taking the lift from my friend's house. I was staying with him on 23rd Street to Times Square every morning, and you just look out the window, and everyone just looks like ants, and no one's smiling, no one's just that energy, that frenetic energy. I think when you're younger, it sort of charges you up.
Different, right?
Yeah, it is
Right.
different when you
I
get
mean, I
older.
loved living there, and I had a very successful business and very well-known business
Yeah.
in New York. So, it was interesting. I mean, it was an A-lister.
Yeah, okay.
And, growing up there was pretty outrageous during the disco times and
Yeah,
all that kind of stuff, so, but, you can't really ever go home again.
that's true. That's interesting, yeah. That's always a good perspective 'cause you're trying to go back to the moment in time that you remember.
Finished.
Yeah, yeah. So what was the impetus to get out of New York?
Well, I mean, it's actually a very interesting time in my life. I started in the foliage industry in 1971.
Wow.
And over the next 25 years, I built a very, very big, very successful foliage distribution business. I was one of the pioneers, at that time, at the end of the whole thing, I had 9 stores. We had a wholesale division. We were importing and exporting. I was a pioneer in that industry,
Yeah.
and I wound up selling the whole shooting match
Hmm,
and retiring. 1994 it was,
okay.
and I retired, and I found out that I met a guy and his father who were Vietnamese.
Hmm,
And the embargo between the US and Vietnam was lifted in
okay,
1994.
okay.
So I got on a plane and I flew to Saigon.
Wow,
And I spent the next year in Saigon trying to help them to rebuild the country.
wow.
And to make a long story short, I wound up staying in Asia for the next 17 years.
Whoa,
And in 2000, I was the CEO of a .com company in Asia
okay.
called the Global Grocer, and raised a few $1 million. At the peak of that whole, you know,
.com craze.
and we wound up living in Thailand, building a farm, starting a big orchid exporting business, and stayed there. And then in 2010, I was on an airplane coming home from China, and I read about Plant Lab
Okay,
doing the first research into indoor farming.
yeah.
So I flew home to Bangkok. I told my wife, I said, I'm going home. And I don't think I was home for a week. I was in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Because of my background, I just kind of knew that vertical farming was the future.
Hmm,
And so I went to Plant Lab and I met with those guys and I tried to buy the US rights to their technology.
hmm,
This was 2010. And I was not able to make a deal with them. They were suffering from the delusions of grandeur that a lot of people were suffering from in those early days.
Yeah.
But I got hooked, and I wound up spending a lot of time in Holland. And I met the people from Philips, and I did this and did that and went to all the shows and, kind of got my feet wet in a whole new area of horticulture that, with my background, it was all pretty not, it wasn't simple and it wasn't obvious, but it was interesting. And it really made me a lot more curious. And then I read about aerofoams
Yeah.
and I reached out to the late Ed Harwood.
Yeah.
And I sent him an email and I told him who I was and, what my interest was. And I said, look, I would like to learn more about this. And I spent the next year, and it was a 12-hour time difference between Bangkok and New Jersey. And I spent the next year, it was midnight my time and noon Ed Harwood's time. And we spent hours on the phone just talking about all this.
Wow.
And after about a year of that, I told my wife, I said, listen, we have to go back to America. I can do this. So we flew back. We went to Miami. I bought 2 used containers. I went to a friend of mine who had probably built 75% of the greenhouses in Dade County.
Hmm.
And I told them what I was going to do. And they had a big metalworking factory. And I designed the first 2 rotanas.
Hmm.
I had no idea what I was doing, Harry. Okay. I mean, I didn't have any, although I had probably bought and sold and, was involved with maybe a couple of $100 million worth of foliage material. But I had no idea what it meant to be a grower.
Hmm.
And I learned about, air and climate and LED lighting and irrigation and just all the, control systems. And oh man, it was an education. And burned up a ton of money, made
Yeah.
every mistake that anybody could possibly make. And after about 3 years, I finally sold the first Grotana. And I sold it to a guy and his wife who knew less than I did. And they were going to grow lettuce and sell it. And, they were going to change the world and they were
Sure.
feed the growing population in 2050. And they were going to do everything that you read about all this nonsense every day. And they failed. And I made a vow that I would never sell another retail container,
Hmm.
that I would do nothing but build, interesting, challenging projects that didn't depend on the sale of commodity crops and, didn't sell to people who knew less than I did.
Mm-hmm.
And that I would just concentrate on, I would surround myself with people, to fill in the blanks that I had
Yeah.
were rapidly disappearing because I was like a sponge.
Hmm.
And, I decided to just stick with my peers. And that's what I've done for the past 15 years.
What a fantastic journey you've been on since
Oh,
those early days in New York.
you're unbelievable. I mean, I have a life that people only dream about. I
Yeah.
have a life that people only dream about. I've had the highest highs and the lowest lows, but I've just kept on putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah. So I'm just fascinated to hear, like, with your perspective and having seen this, from its infancy and realizing early on what the value was in indoor farming, but having had your experiences, decades before, I'm curious about your perspective now because I entered it in 2020, which is basically the peak of the hype cycle or one of the hype cycles. And obviously tons of money coming in and lots of folks ending up bankrupt afterwards. So how do you see things and how do you see the cycle? It's been talked about a lot at some of the conferences we've been at recently, but I get the sense that you provide some bit of realism for folks having been there and done that when it comes to like expectations and where you see things going for this industry?
I've always had a realistic attitude about it. And, it's funny because 15 years ago, when I made certain comments, I was an asshole. Okay. And now I'm a guru, because listen, I've always been a businessman, and I've always had a cash flow positive attitude. And I've always, from day one, been sink or swim. Nobody ever gave me anything. You know what I mean? Whatever I've ever done, if I made money, it was my money. And if I lost money, it was my money.
Yeah.
And, I started off the same as everybody. I thought that indoor farming was going to change the world. And again, I thought that, yeah, we're going to feed, the population is going to grow and we're going to have to, find ways to feed those people. And I thought that nonprofits and NGOs and, every, I had this interesting kind of a shotgun approach early on. I was willing to try anything. I didn't know what was right, you know, but I knew that container farming or indoor farming had a place. I just didn't know what that place was,
Hmm.
and we still don't know what that place is. Okay. And it's, 15 years later. But, you know, I tried each thing and I learned step by step that, it's a business just like any other business. It's not easy. There's a lot of dreamers, when there was easy money. And, I think that the biggest enemy of vertical farming was a very easy money,
Yeah.
Silicon Valley, and social media.
Mm.
Okay. I think that if left unchecked, they'll destroy this industry, you know, but at the same time, I think that people learn the social media lesson through Freight Farm because they spent 10,000 a month to create a community that was really just a way of holding their buyers hostage.
Mm. Wow.
And when it collapsed, you know what I mean? Hundreds of people were left holding the bag. And I think that, it started off with good intentions. And I think it went to the toilet.
Hmm.
You know, I think that the promises that they made to people and the way they went about it, you know what I mean? Psychologically, it was perfect.
Yeah.
But from having a conscience and from a integrity standpoint, it was disgusting.
Hmm. So do you think, Glenn, you mentioned that it's just interesting that you mentioned the social media. So is it this perspective of like telling a story that looks good on paper or
Yeah.
it's flashy, but is really not really what's happening behind closed
Yeah,
doors?
absolutely. I think that 30% or maybe even higher, I think that 30% of the businesses or the companies in this industry are nothing more than a website.
Hmm. Hmm.
That it's just some guy sitting in a room, you know what I mean, with a flashy website.
Yeah.
It's like when I was young and somebody went into business, the first thing they did was have business cards made up.
Yep. I remember that.
Okay. The first thing you did, okay, you had the idea, you went straight to the printer and had a business card made. Okay. Today, when you have an idea, the first thing you do is go to the web designer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And if you're like me and you read the headline and then you decide that it's time to do a little research, then you start to read where they say, we're going to do this. We're planning to do that. We're thinking about becoming the number one this and the top that. And we're a thought leader and all this buzzword bullshit. And it's just like, you know, it's just an evolution. In other words, it's like all potatoes, no meat,
Mm. Yeah.
and it's just the 2025 version, you know what I mean? Listen, everybody has ideas. You know what I mean? Listen, I have 10 ideas a day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Same.
But I discard, I think about them and I discard today's 10 and I deal with tomorrow's 10, but it's just not real. I mean, listen, you're better off. What's wrong with having a nice business that you enjoy, that's small, that you make a good living,
Mm,
that you have a smile on your face. And, I remember when I was in the foliage business and I was making a fortune, Harry. I'm
yeah,
talking about, 40 years ago, making serious money.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. And I remember, I lived in a beautiful home. I drove a brand new Mercedes. I traveled all over the world. I did whatever I wanted to do. And I had all my friends. They were in the garment center. They
Mm,
were doctors. They were lawyers. They wore a suit and tie. You know what I mean? They were dentists, and me, I wore, Bruno Magli shoes and jeans and a hoodie. You know what I mean?
yeah,
And I was making a fortune,
yeah.
and, you know, I laughed at all. You know what I mean? Because I had this unbelievable business that, I mean, I spent a week every 3 weeks traveling through Homestead, Florida, buying plants.
Hmm,
I mean, think about it for a minute.
yeah.
You know what I mean? The sun is shining, the birds are singing. You know what I mean? I'm
You're out every
walking
day.
through, yeah, it's hot, it's beautiful, involved with farmers, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And people of the land,
yeah,
everybody with mud on their boots and dirt under their nails.
yeah,
And you know what I mean? And, sit down and have a cold drink, under the palm trees or under the limes or mangoes or avocados.
yeah.
It was the greatest life in the world, you know? And I mean, people, they all want to be flashy and have, you know, valuations. When I was in business, there was no such thing as valuation. You worked your ass off and you made a good living.
It's either profitable or it's not.
Yeah, right. You either profitable or you work for someone else.
Yeah. So
I mean, it was very simple.
how did you get into foliage?
It's a long story. Listen, I mean, I don't tell my, I came from a very, very, very rough, dysfunctional childhood. There was drugs involved. I had all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
Okay. If you would have looked at me then, you know what I mean? Even myself, okay, I can't imagine how I've turned my life around,
Yeah.
you know? And I mean, I had everything going against everything, and I had no money. I mean, I was a classic, you know, you could make a movie out of my life,
Mm,
how bad it was. And I just decided one day to sell plants.
hmm.
I mean, that simple. I just saw this indoor plant boom coming.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I borrowed $5,000 and opened a store in New Haven, Connecticut,
Yeah.
by Yale University. And like I say, within the next 25 years, you know what I mean? I built it into a multi-million-dollar business. But I had everything going against me. And I think that all of the energy that and all of the effort that I put into just staying alive in the early days, I just put it into business.
Yeah.
And I worked and I learned and I asked questions and I just put one foot in front of the other. I mean, now in retrospect, I'm sober for over 35 years.
Congrats.
I haven't touched a drink, haven't had a drug, haven't, done anything. And I've lived the complete opposite. And every day I try to make up for the bad things that I've done.
Hmm.
So even though I kind of forgive myself because I had to survive,
Yeah, of
but
course.
I just have a different ethos. I'm very focused on integrity and honesty and gratitude.
Yeah. Those are
You
important
know,
traits for sure.
yeah, and they're very important, and they guide a lot of my decisions and a
Yeah.
lot of my thinking, and and I try to be helpful and supportive, and I'm not, I'm full, I'm not empty,
Yeah.
so I try to give it away.
So when you started CEA Advisors, what types of folks were you helping and what type of problems were you solving in the beginning that are and how are they different than the type of work you're doing now?
But it's not different. In other words, I have a business approach to indoor farming. In other words, and sometimes my service is just telling somebody don't do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Sometimes, and I can do that.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know what I mean? And I feel good about it. Like, yeah, I'm sorry that I couldn't make any money. You know what I mean? But I also want to sleep good tonight.
Mhm.
And I've been involved in I've helped a lot of people in the industry. Some I've gotten paid from and some I just did it because it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We build containers. I've been able to take all of the experiences and all of the, you know, um, different lessons that I've learned in life,
Mhm.
and put them into a business kind of a context, you know, and I bring a lot to the table. I have a really, really good read on things.
Mm.
When most people see the headline, that's what they digest. And when I see the headline, that's the beginning of my research to
Yeah.
find out what's really going on.
Dig deeper.
Yeah, much deeper. You know what I mean? And, it's like before I talk to somebody on the phone or, before I talk to a client, I try to find out who they are. And, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What can I really bring to the table?
Yeah.
So I see things very clearly. I mean, but really clearly.
Mhm.
Sometimes I even surprise myself because, I get it, but then something happens to confirm that, yeah, I really do get it,
Mm.
you know? And, look, I think it's a great business and I think there's some really good people in this industry. And I think that, there's a little too much gullibility,
Mm.
and a little bit too much, people that are impressed with themselves, and, I think it's a tough balance, you know what I mean? And I think that, it's just, look, remember something. You're mainly dealing with commodity crops.
Yeah.
You're dealing with, high volume, low margin. People don't realize that this is a very, very relationship based business, and the established leafy greens producers, if they see a vertical farm operator, and I'm talking about a vertical farm operator. I'm not talking about a greenhouse operator. Greenhouse is a greenhouse.
Sure, sure.
Okay. Although now all of a sudden greenhouses are high tech.
We're getting
Okay.
hybrid.
That's a whole other story. You know what I mean? Greenhouses are greenhouses.
Yeah.
But, I think that the established California and Arizona, leafy greens producers, if they felt that indoor farming was a threat, they would crush them.
Yeah.
Okay. What would it stop somebody from California with 100,000 acres from, going to Publix and putting romaine up for 99 cents for a week?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Let's face it. So obviously, although it is a category, you know what I mean? It's still not, a high enough percentage in the produce aisle to really mean anything.
So what is that just a perspective that needs to change? Is it consumers' awareness and education about the difference in the products? Or you feel like it's just always gonna be 2 different camps and the people who know and appreciate it?
Yeah, I think it's, in other words, listen, I wouldn't pay extra for organic.
Mhm.
I wouldn't pay extra for local.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Even me, I mean, I should have some allegiance to my industry, but I buy Texas grown 3 in a bag romaine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you see, when I go into the supermarket, and I go to the supermarket in every country, everywhere in the world. As soon as I get to where I'm going, one of my first stops is always the supermarket
Yeah.
and looking at the produce aisle just to see who's who and what's what and the pricing and the quality and just to get a feel for that market. But that visual is also an indicator of the success of the people in that market.
Mm.
Okay. You know, I remember when I looked at Agricool in France. Was it in Monoprix? I didn't say Bon Marché, but it
Okay.
wasn't. It was in Monoprix, and in the supermarket chain there, and they had the little half ounce, herbs,
Yeah.
prepackaged herbs,
Yeah.
and each item there was like 12 packages, none missing.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and they had like 12 heads of their lettuce, and maybe one was missing from the display.
Yeah.
And a month later, they were bankrupt.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with cholera, and it's the same thing with every one of them. You know what I mean? Listen, as much as I love Gotham Greens, all their products were in the Kroger near me, and their prices were all reduced.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not a good thing.
Well, there
But those are the kind of statistics, that I pay attention.
that makes sense. Yeah. And so how do you think about this? If someone is consulting you, and let's stick with leafy greens, they're looking to get in this business. Obviously, they've seen the graveyard of companies that have tried and failed. Is there a model that works, or is there something like that hasn't been thought through enough yet to how this could get some traction?
Harry, it's all a giant spreadsheet.
Mm,
Okay. Every facet of this industry is an Excel spreadsheet.
yeah.
Okay. On the left hand side, you put all of the different exigencies. Okay. Whether it, you know, um, price, climate,
Mm,
or, what I mean? Whatever issues are, market share, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then you have to make adjustments along the right hand side to get to that sweet spot.
yeah.
Okay. Energy cost, labor, you know, sophistication of the market.
Mm,
What are the people eat? I
yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
is there any demand there?
Yeah.
You know, it's a whole equation, you know what I mean, that consists of a lot of different things. But, the truth of the matter is that this whole industry, in other words, farm to table is not a straight line.
No.
You understand? There's 50 different stops along that way that can be improved on, or where there's areas for expertise. You know, in other words, if somebody decides they want to get involved with indoor farming, they don't have to be a grower.
Yeah.
They could design control systems. They
Mhm.
could, get interested in irrigation. They could get interested in packaging. They could,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? In other
Yeah.
words, but people don't really, they don't analyze they don't see the whole picture,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
So when with the work you've done with Growtainer, how has the shipping container business evolved over the years, and what are people looking for now, and how are you helping them?
Well, right, I'm going through the same. Well, let me say this. The past 15 years, as I said earlier, I sold one retail container. I vowed to never sell another one.
Yeah.
Okay. I've built a very successful, very healthy business doing commercial container installations for my industry peers.
Mhm.
Okay. I've built for Driscoll. I built for beneficial insectary. I built for ball horticulture, but not for production,
Yeah.
for research, for some sort. I've been able to give them what they need to solve a specific problem.
Okay.
Okay. Or to increase their business or to do something to help their core competency.
Yeah.
Okay. Why? Because I understand their business and I understand mine.
Mhm.
And I know what I can do for them, and I know what I tell them I can't do.
Yeah.
Okay. And if I don't know, I know who to call.
Yeah.
Okay. But, you know, I'm at a point right now with this freight fall demise, and understand something. I offer a product that I can't sell. I have to wait for somebody to come to me to buy it.
Hmm.
You understand? A custom container.
Yeah.
I can't call somebody and say, "Hey, do you need this? Do you need that?" You know
Yeah.
what I mean? I would be nothing but on the phone all day.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I have to wait for somebody to say, "Oh, I need to try this. Maybe I'll try a container." And they'll get on the phone with me and we'll talk about it. And if it makes sense, we'll move forward,
Yeah.
you know? And I got a lot of really, really interesting projects in the hopper, you
Mhm.
know. But right now, with the demise of freight farms, I wonder if I want to get into retail.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And I think about it, you know what I mean? And I think to myself, I don't necessarily agree with that style of growing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people wanted it because, I mean, I've never agreed with it. Okay. I think plants are, crops are made to grow, on a flat surface. I've never, I think if God wanted them to grow sideways, if plant agriculture for the past 1,000 years would have
Yeah.
been different.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've never really seen that, to tell you
Y
the truth. But, and I don't know why people want it, except maybe because it was out there from somebody who made a lot of noise, who used social media,
Sure.
who created this, this method of growing.
Yeah.
Like I'll give you an example. Freight farms made a lot of sales to schools.
Mhm.
Personally, I think that was a tremendous disservice. Okay. Because if you want to teach kids how to grow, you have to teach them all different ways of growing so they decide which one is best for them.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. And every crop is different. You know what I mean? And if it's an educational tool, a freight farm was not an educational tool. Okay. Stephen Ritz is an educational tool.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
You follow me?
Yeah.
But, you know, but these are the kind of thoughts that go through my head. You know what I mean? But so if we build for schools, we're going to put every different type of growing method in there so that a kid can get their hands dirty
Yeah.
and learn and say, okay, this is the way, this is the method for me.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know how, in other words, before freight farms, who grew sideways?
It's a couple of folks.
Nobody.
Yeah.
I remember Indoor Farms of America. Did you ever hear of them?
No, I hadn't. No.
They had that, sideways plant wall kind of deal.
Yeah.
And they were going to do this and they were going to do that and they were going to change the world. And all of a sudden their website said, as of such and such a date, we have ceased operation,
Yeah.
and they talked bad about everyone else. And, they were in the business for 15 minutes, been and gone in 15 minutes, and they were industry experts, you know?
So when you go to these conferences and we bumped into each other at Indoor Icon, which is one of my favorites, what do you look for and what do you see that's changing? My quick take on it was people are a bit more realistic and sober about what's been happening in the past few years. I'm curious what your take on is on and what you hear from these conversations.
Well, I think that this past 2 years, it's definitely settled down a bit. I think that the lack of easy money is a good thing,
Yeah.
and Harry, I'll tell you something. I have a lot of conversations with a lot of people, from business people to academia, all kinds of interesting people. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a professor in Australia of indoor farming. And I said to him, I said, now that the dust is settled and the VC model is been proven not to work in vertical farming, I said, the first thing you should ask your students is, why are you here? Why are you in this class?
Mm,
Because if you're in it for fast money, you know what I mean? And all the stuff that was 2 years ago or 5 years ago, then you're in the wrong class. So what I've heard is a lot more optimism, a lot less hype.
yeah.
I think that one of the problems is that there's still a whole group of new, well, like suppliers and vendors and people trying to capitalize on this industry
Yeah.
that have not fully connected the dots.
Hmm.
They don't know enough about the industry that they're in to really be as effective as they could be.
Yeah. Or they're coming in having maybe come at the time when they saw, like, the wave or the bubble and trying to understand if this was something they could capitalize on. I think about those students. If they came in and started studying this because they saw the dollar signs in 2020, they got a big wake-up call,
Right.
a couple years later.
Yeah. In other words, there's a lot of like, you know, and for me, if somebody asks me, what about my IP or what about my product? How do what do you think about it?
Yeah.
The problem with me is I give them a completely honest answer. You know what I mean? And, I think that people are blind. You know what I mean? They don't want to hear some people don't really want to hear the truth.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
You know, I mean, listen, me personally, I got nothing invested in being right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you ask me a question, I'm going to give you an honest answer and hope that it helps. I still think with this industry has got a lot of growing up to do,
Mm,
but I don't think it's as out of balance as it has been,
yeah.
you know?
So when you have conversations with folks, are you seeing folks or businesses or companies or even people, individuals that are doing it right, that are thinking it through the right way and asking the right questions?
No, I think they're doing better than they were.
Okay.
I mean, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think that, if somebody builds a product, you know, I guess, as I've watched the evolution of this industry, I've seen people go into the LED business.
Mhm.
Then the LED business got too crowded. I've seen people go into control systems.
Yeah.
Control systems got too crowded.
Yeah.
Now the new one is robotics and automation and AI.
Yeah.
Okay. But the truth of the matter is that robotics, yeah, I mean, it definitely serves, it has a place in the industry,
Yeah.
but it's not the end all be all. Automation, not the end all be all. Why do you need automation, for example, in a country where somebody makes, $30 a day?
Yeah.
So, in other words, but the people that are in automation thinks it works everywhere and it should apply in every
Yeah.
case and it makes economic sense in every, you know, alliteration. But it's not true. I mean,
It's that saying that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
mm, and it's sad because, a lot of these people are nice people. They're smart.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But they just don't do their homework.
What I love is that you got you basically cut your chops, just from trying and
Yeah.
failing and succeeding, and definitely the thick skin and the ability to tell people what they need to hear. I mean, I hear that New Yorker coming through you loud and clear. And sometimes people are like, they want their ego stroked and they want to
Mm,
hear what they think is the right thing. And it's sometimes really harsh to be told something that you know in your heart is true and your ego is not allowing you to like listen to what this person
yeah.
on the other
People
side of you
don't
is saying.
listen. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. I
Yeah.
mean, people don't listen. You know, I mean, they want to hear what they want to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, like Bill, I'm just thinking about some specific instances, you know what I mean, where people, "Oh, nice to meet you, but we've heard so much about you. What do you think about product?" And I'm like, "I think it's great, but,"
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It's not going to wind up the way you think it's going to wind up,
Mhm.
and I don't want to be arrogant and I don't want to be obnoxious. It's like over the past 10 or 15 years, I've seen a million of these little desktop herb growing, I mean, I've seen a million of them,
Of course.
and then you get some guy calls me and oh, look at this beautiful desktop herb growing, apparatus that I built
Yeah.
and whatever. And you're like, yeah, but 100 of them before you wind up on in the closet on the shelf. Not one has ever succeeded.
Yeah.
And even Aero Garden, the one from, I forgot who it's from, but even the one that was successful
Yeah.
for a few years is now $29.99. You know what I mean? Where
Yeah.
it was $129.99.
Yeah. Yeah.
People think that they build a vertical, like that fits in the place where your dishwasher goes.
Yep. The
You know what I mean?
appliances.
Yeah, it's nonsense. People are not gonna, they're gonna go to the supermarket,
Yeah.
you know, and I mean, that was a very interesting lesson for me. I did the first project for a supermarket. We
Okay.
bought the container behind the supermarket
Yeah.
and we sold the material inside. And that day, I thought that was it. I had struck gold, and I figured to myself, I'm going to put a container behind every supermarket in the country.
Yeah.
I quickly found out that out of 25,000 supermarkets in America, maybe there were 500 of them could do what I did, and then I found out that out of those 500, maybe 100 had the right access and egress and
Yeah.
logistics capabilities for it to work,
Yeah.
you know? And those are the kind of lessons that I've learned. It's, I mean, I don't know. It seems like everybody thinks this industry is one size fits all.
Yeah.
And it's just not, you know what I mean? I tried to position growtainers in indoor farming for the cosmetics industry.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out they have no interest in it. Okay. I thought I had this brainstorm to use containers for disaster relief.
Yeah.
Figured, oh, I'm going to make a fortune. You know what I mean? FEMA will buy 1,000,
Yeah.
no interest in it.
Mm.
I mean, I tried to approach some pharmaceutical manufacturing. You know what I mean? Because I figured there was some botanical products that, like some tree that grows in the Amazon,
Yeah. Extracts. Yeah.
they have no interest in it. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, if you build the farm and you go to the Amazon and you find the tree and you grow it and you spend millions of dollars on testing and all and then take the results and go to the lab and say, okay, I have this product. It's X dollars a ton. How many tons do you want? They're like, oh, fine, I'll take 100 tons.
Sure. But
Yep.
you got to do the work.
Right. I'm not doing all the work, spending all the money.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? For something that you might buy.
Yeah.
It can work that way.
So where are you seeing the most opportunities now in terms of like product market fit, crops? What's anything that's catching your
I
eye?
don't know.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, like I say, from my own experience, you know, I mean, listen, remember something, Harry. A grotana or a container farm, okay, it's extremely limited.
Yeah.
Okay, you can only grow a shallow root crop because if you grow a deep root crop, you lose the vertical
Yep.
economy.
Yeah.
Okay, if you take wasabi, for example,
Yeah.
unbelievable crop,
Yeah.
unbelievable crop with tremendous potential in a container, tremendous potential. Okay, but the best you're going to do is cut a 3-year growing cycle down to about a year or a year and a half.
Yeah.
Okay, you got no income for a year or a year and a half. You know what I mean? Nobody's going to do it,
Yeah.
except somebody who's laser focused on wasabi. You know, we're doing projects for wasabi for research.
Okay.
We're doing projects for Japan, for rice for research,
Okay.
But it's strictly a research
Yeah.
project. I have people call me every day for containers for strawberry.
Yeah.
And I tell them you can't make any money. And they're, oh, but what about Russia in the winter? Well, then go build it in Russia. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Why? I don't understand. We go to the supermarket right now. We're paying for Driscoll, beautiful big strawberries, $3 a pound,
Yeah.
which means that the farmer is getting $1 a pound.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. You know what I mean? So think I'm going to build a strawberry container and then when it fails, you're going to blame me? No way.
All comes back to that spreadsheet.
Yeah. It all comes back to that spreadsheet. And if, I mean, but people, strawberries, $22 a pound in Stockholm in February. Okay. But what about July?
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't know. I mean, people just don't get it. Listen, I don't know. To go back to the whole core conversation here, I don't know if I build a $99,000 Freight Farms wannabe,
Mhm.
will it sell?
That's the big question. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I could do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I could spend 10,000 a month on advertising and do all the same stuff that they did. Do I really want to do that?
Would the market bear something like that? I guess really it's looking deep, having a close look at, why they failed, and I think you definitely outlined some of the key points, focus on selling something through social that wasn't really the true story. But they also, at the end of the day, the economics of, like, did you have a product that the market wanted? Clearly, there was some disconnect there, and I think those questions are still being asked.
People, I mean, I talk to people who operate freight farms, you know, and I love the way everybody jumped in to help them. I mean, the people in Canada, that what they don't tell you is that the guys in Canada, their containers are $300,000. You know what I mean? But they're going to support the freight farm community.
Yeah.
What are they going to do?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Send them a box of Kleenex. I mean, but everybody, we're here to support the freight farm community. What exactly are you doing?
Yeah.
Having somebody, listen to your lament. Listen, I think that, like I say, I think the way they went sour was disgusting.
Mm.
But those are the people that really need the helping hand. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? The
Yeah.
ones who lost their deposits.
Hmm.
You know,
And these are, I mean, people just getting started, small farms and probably
right?
putting their life savings into trying this out, and probably, it's a big hit for them.
Yeah, I mean that's a terrible thing. You know what I mean? That's a really terrible thing. But the truth of the matter is that farming in a container is a tough business. Okay. It works, but nobody's going to get rich at it. It's like, you know, I've always said it, it's too big for a farmer's market and too small for a supermarket.
Yeah.
Well, but the truth of the matter is that, like people call us for microgreens containers,
Yeah.
and I tell people I won't sell you a 40-foot microgreens container because you'll never be able to sell what you produce.
Yeah.
I'll sell you a 20-footer, but I won't sell you a 40.
Yeah.
You know, we're doing very well with tissue culture containers.
Okay.
We're doing very well with, like I say, some of the custom projects that we're working on, and, we're getting a lot of traction with different government, food security based, research and, a lot of interesting stuff,
Yeah.
stuff that, listen, if I'm challenged, I'm doing this for over 50 years. Okay. And I'm surrounded by the top of the line. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, really knowledgeable, clever, smart, that put the pieces together and understand. And, and we're all curious, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
we're all, really, we're geeky about this whole thing.
Yeah.
I designed this really elaborate, I'm doing a project. I'm not going to say who it's for, but I'm doing a project for the largest potato grower in the world.
Oh, wow.
Potatoes.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we had a big conversation this morning about humidity,
Yeah.
and about propagation and all that. And I designed this unbelievable propagation system that nobody's really done because it works, distributes the humidity evenly in a multi-level system.
Hmm.
Okay, and it's Israeli technology, and it's
Yeah.
very, very cool.
Yeah.
You know, and so I had a whole meeting with their plant science people this morning. You know what I mean? And we're integrating VPD into the containers, and we're doing some really interesting stuff for them. And all of us got off the phone this morning, and and like we debriefed afterwards,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we were like, wow, you know what I mean? These people are professional plant scientists,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And we're, you know, builders,
Yeah.
and you combine the two, and man, what a great conversation,
That's when
you
it gets
know?
fun.
Yeah, and it becomes real fun.
Yeah.
And then, it's the easiest thing to say, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Mm.
And I'm writing down everything they're saying. I should have recorded the conversation.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, between what I figured out and what they figured out and what, you know what I mean? We came up with a perfect system,
That's
you
great.
know? But, I just don't know why with freight farms or without freight farms, why the expectations or the potential of this thing has changed. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I said before, I don't know if I want to build a horizontal system. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think I'm better off to stay with something that offers more flexibility and more, customization and
Yeah.
more opportunity.
Yeah, it sounds like the custom projects, like the one you just mentioned with the potatoes, is where, like, you get to use your brain power and all
Oh, I
your
love it. I
decades of
love it.
experience combined with new technologies, and now you're actually problem solving now.
Yeah. I mean, and I call, like the technical support people at one of the component manufacturers. And I'm like, well, look, this is who I am. This is what I
Yeah.
want to do. You're an expert on this product. And what do you think about my idea? And they're like, wow, I'm doing this for 30 years. I never thought of that. You know what I mean? I'm like,
Yeah,
oh,
that's great.
great. You know,
You gotta
but
bring in people from different disciplines
oh,
sometimes because
yeah.
sometimes people, if they're just in one lane, they don't think outside their lane, and
Yeah, really.
someone
I
like
mean, I
you.
spend more time
Yeah.
thinking outside the box.
So,
Listen,
Glenn.
I'd like to do a double decker container.
Oh, yeah.
16 foot. Yeah, take the floor out and the ceiling. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Have one 16-foot high chamber.
Yeah. No one's done that yet?
Never.
Huh. Wonder what the challenges would be around that, but, it sounds like.
Nothing really. I mean, it's very easy to engineer it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I mean, you could do it
Yeah.
and it would be very interesting. But, at this point right now, I'm getting lazy. You know what I mean? I'm just really doing stuff that I enjoy.
That's great.
And again, I turn away more business than I accept. And I just, listen, I just want to enjoy it.
Yeah.
I want to know what I know. And one of the things that I'm learning is what to stay away from,
Yeah.
you know, and it's interesting, and I feel bad for these people that are struggling, that they went into it with good intentions. And,
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to hear of a guy who has to sell Monday through Thursday so he can pay people on Friday.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not why you go into business.
They've
I
created their own version of the hamster wheel.
Yeah, really. I mean, and it's a shame. You know what I mean? I hate hearing.
Yeah. So I.
Look. I mean, I think that I hate to say it, but I don't know if the industry has really learned anything from freight farms' demise.
Mm.
Okay, I think that you know people are very good at making excuses.
Yeah.
And just guiding the conversation back to where they want it to go.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something. One of the things that I've really noticed is who hasn't commented on freight fall
Mm.
is more important than the people that have.
Hmm. That's interesting.
Okay. And if you take all the LinkedIn superstars,
Yeah.
okay, and you go back through all of the freight farms and smallhold and all the high profile popular kids bankruptcies,
Yeah.
you'll see who didn't comment is more important than who did.
That's interesting. Yeah. Lots to learn from, and I think it's interesting for you to have that perspective because I think most people are just focused on who's commenting. But then you, to your point, like you have to think about what's their ulterior motive. If they have a company that could benefit from them, or are they just, looking good so they could, it's more of a marketing play at that point. It's just like, hey, let's make sure we're in this conversation because they don't want to be
Right.
left out of the
Well, let's make
conversation.
sure we're not in that conversation.
Yeah, yeah. So, Glenn, I like to leave as we wrap up. I always leave a couple of minutes for, and you've got a lot of guidance for this industry. So maybe something you've said already, but in the interest of like fostering conversations between everyone in this space, I like leaving a couple of minutes at the end for any just messages that, or parting words for this industry. And especially with you and given your experience and what you've seen in terms of the hype and the ups and downs. Sometimes we do need elder statesmen in the room to sort of talk, about how things really are.
Well, I think that the most important thing is that if somebody decides to go into this business, I think the first thing they need to do is go sit in the room by yourself and ask yourself, why am I doing this?
Hmm.
And if your response is for the money, well, for anything other than, you know what I mean, to build a nice business that you can
Yeah.
enjoy and just do something good for yourself and your community,
Yeah.
don't do it. I mean, it's as simple as that. This is not a throw the money. This is not a put the seed in the ground and take the money to the bank.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work that way,
Yeah.
you know, and network and ask questions, and listen,
Yeah.
and just, do your homework and do your research and, spend 10 minutes behind the head after the headline, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And find out what's really going on.
That's really
But more important than anything, the most important thing, is to whatever you do with it, honesty and integrity.
mm,
Look in the mirror and like what you see.
I think some people probably have a challenge with just that that part of the instructions, and I think
You
it's
know,
important.
and Harry, gotta believe, and I'm not going to throw any stones, but you gotta believe that a lot of my thinking of who I want to be as a human being
Yeah.
is based on some anecdotal evidence. Okay.
Yeah.
That I've seen other people do things that I just don't want to be that person,
Yeah.
So
Well, it's been a fascinating insight into your world, Glenn, and I'm glad we finally made the time to have this conversation, and you've got a lot of experience and a lot of stories and been through that school of hard knocks several times, I might imagine, to get to where you are. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. I really enjoyed it. And I think you have a lot of wisdom for this industry. And I hope people pay attention to what you have to say because, I mean, you've seen what works and what doesn't. But I think giving people the unvarnished truth, I think, is more important at the end of the day so people don't get into other hype cycles down the line.
yeah, well, they're out there, that's for sure. Everybody's found their sweet spot,
Yeah.
and it's a shame because, like I say, people just, social media is not a good thing,
Hmm.
But anyway, look, my door is open, as long as people come to me the right way,
Yeah.
I'll give them 5 minutes. You know what I mean? But if they come the wrong way, 5 minutes is four too many.
What's the best way for folks to get in contact with you?
Email,
Email. Okay. We'll make sure
email.
we'll put it in the show notes. I think we've got that. And we'll make sure people can
Yeah,
connect
no,
with you.
I'm more than happy to help if somebody is
Yeah.
sincere. You
Yeah.
know, Harry, it was good talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Likewise. I'm looking. When's your next conference?
Oh, Green Tech.
Oh, Green Tech. Yeah.
Yeah, Green Tech. And then after Green Tech, I'm taking a week and just, uh, I'm going to Marseille
Oh, nice.
and to Provence.
That sounds nice. Hopefully
My
it's first.
wife is the show ends on Thursday, and my wife is meeting me. I'm meeting my wife in Paris
That's
and we're
beautiful.
taking a week and traveling around France.
Oh, that's gonna be nice. Well, say hi to Sepper because Sepper's gonna be out there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I know he wants to connect with you as well. So I appreciate your time, Glenn.
Okay, thank you.